As the war against the Arachnids carries on, our brave soldiers in the Astra Militarum regiment known as the Mobile Infantry have captured an enemy leader called a brain bug. Commissar and Psyker Carl Barney Jenkins has been sent to the planet to gather intelligence on this new enemy. Now we can go live to the planet to hear what he has to say.
Suit up! Suit up!
Hello and welcome to Droncom T. Today, to complete a trilogy of Starship Troopers inspired videos, I'm going to be painting up an Imperial Guard Commissar model inspired by the design of Carl from Starship Troopers.
You know, whenever the three of us are together, I feel like things might just work out.
So as you can see, I've primed the model black, as this will give us a nice smooth, even base coat for the rest of our colours to work from. Now the first thing I'm doing is I'm coming in with some Corvus black, and I'm going to paint all over his coat and his boots with a couple of layers of Corvus black. Corvus black is a slightly lighter shade of black than the Chaos black I've used to prime the model, and this will allow us to shade the model and add some definition all over these areas of black. So just make sure you catch all of the areas you want to be black with a couple of layers of Corvus black till we build up to a nice smooth, even black base coat all over the coat, boots and hat. Now I'm painting this Imperial Commissar model inspired by the uniform that Carl wears at the end of Starship Troopers, the most iconic outfit that he wears in the whole film. And with that Corvus black applied, you can see it's lightened up those areas of jacket, boots and hat, while still keeping a nice dark black colour. So the next step is with a little bit of Nuln oil, I'm going to shade all of these areas we just painted with Corvus black. This will add some definition to these areas and allow us to highlight them quickly and easily before we start painting the rest of the model. So with some Nuln oil, make sure you shade all of the areas we just painted with Corvus black with a shade of Nuln oil. Once that Nuln oil has dried, you can see it's added some definition into the recesses of all those areas we painted with Corvus black. So now it's time to highlight these areas up. To start with, I'm coming in with some Eshin Grey. I'm going to apply this as a dry brush all over these areas. You can be quite strong with this dry brush. Just make sure you catch all of these areas with a dry brush of Eshin Grey. We pick out all of those raised details and add definition all over these areas. You can see that Eshin Grey's really picked out all the raised areas on his coat and really highlighted them up. So now with some Mechanica Standard Grey, I'm going to come in and apply another dry brush all over these areas of black, but a lot lighter this time, so I'll just catch the most raised details and sharpest edges and just highlight all these areas of fabric. And finally, with some Dawnstone, I'm going to come in and apply a thin edge highlight on the rim of his hat, the very tips of his boots. These would be the sharpest and most polished areas, so it just look like the light's catching these sharp angles. And with that Dawnstone applied, that is all of the black areas painted and highlighted. So now we can move on and paint the rest of the model. So first of all, I'm coming in with some Bugman's Glow, and I'm going to paint this all over the skin on the model. Obviously be nice and careful around all the areas of black that we've already painted and dry brushed. But just pick out any areas of exposed skin, like his face and his hands, with a couple of layers of Bugman's Glow to build up to a nice solid base coat on all the areas of skin. So take your time, be nice and careful around the areas that we've already highlighted. Just pick out all the skin with some Bugman's Glow. And with a couple of layers of Bugman's Glow applied, we've picked out all of those areas of skin on the model. So now it's time to start painting in some details. So with some Mechanica Standard Grey, I'm going to come in and paint the belt on the model. This will brighten the belt up, make it stand out against the black, and tie it into that grey uniform. We painted it on that mobile infantry trooper to help tie this model in to the army. I'm also picking out these little bits of fabric here on his arm guards. I'm just going to pick this out with some Mechanica Standard Grey to tie it in with the rest of the model. With that Mechanica Standard Grey applied, added a little tonal change of colour to the middle of the model. So now with some Rhinox hide, I'm coming in, I'm going to paint all of the pouches on the model. So it's got these ones here hanging around his waist. Just picking these out with a layer of Rhinox hide so I can paint them up like leather later. It's again obviously be nice and careful around the areas we've already painted, especially the black that we've already highlighted. Just make sure you pick out all of these pouches with a layer of Rhinox hide. And with all of those pouches picked out, next we're going to paint is the band on his hat. So for this I'm coming with some Celestra Grey. I mean nice and careful, and I'm just going to catch this band going around his hat. Obviously be really careful around the skin and the rest of the hat. Just make sure you pick out this band with a thin layer of Celestra Grey. And with that band picked out, the next thing I'm going to paint is the little bit of cabling coming off of his power sword. So for this I'm using Corn Red. And I'm just going to pick out this bit of cable coming off his power sword. This will add a little pop of colour to the model, help break up all these darker colours that we're using everywhere else. Just pick out this cable with some Corn Red. And with that cable picked out, the next thing we'll do is pick out the casing on the gun. So for this I'm coming in with Corvus Black again. I'm just going to pick out the casing on his bolt pistol. So you don't need to be too worried about being too neat around the areas surrounding the casing. Just make sure you pick out all of the casing to his bolt pistol with some Corvus Black. And with that gun casing picked out, now the only thing left to base coat are the metallics. So first of all, I'm coming in with lead belcher. I'm going to pick out the blade to his power sword. I'm going to catch all of this with a couple of layers of lead belcher. All of the metallic parts on his bolt pistol as well. Picking all of these out with some lead belcher as well. Being especially careful when I'm around his hands and other details we've already painted. I'm just going to pick out the engine on his wrist guard here, as well as the rest of the plate for the wrist guard. I'm going to catch all of this with some lead belcher. And any of these plates here on his uniform, catching all of these with a couple of layers of lead belcher as well. Just being really careful around the areas of black we've already painted and highlighted. Just making sure I catch all of these plates with some lead belcher. And I'm also going to catch the buckle to his belt with lead belcher as well. Being nice and careful, just catching the raised metallic areas of his buckle. And with all that lead belcher applied, there's just one final base coat left to apply to the model. That will be to pick out some gold details. So for this I'm using Retributor armour. And I'm going to pick up all of these symbols that are on the model. So it's this winged skull here on his chest plate. Being nice and careful around both the lead belcher and any areas of black. I'm also picking out the Aquila on his hat here, making sure I cover this with a couple of layers of Retributor armour. And I'm going to pick out the hilt to his power sword as well as the little power node coming up the blade as well. I'm going to make sure I catch all of this with a couple of layers of Retributor armour. And finally, on these raised edges to all of these plates of metal, I'm going to catch the raised edge with some Retributor armour as well to really break up that colour and add interest all over the model. Be nice and careful with these and just pick out all of these edges with some Retributor armour.
Do you go to the moon and stuff?
Well, not the moon you're familiar with, though I have been to the smoon.
And with that Retributor armour applied, there's all the base coats applied to the model. So now the next step is to shade the miniature. So first of all, with some Reichland Flesh Shade, I'm going to come in and shade all of the areas of skin. So it's his face and his hands. I'm going to catch these with a shade of Reichland Flesh Shade. And with some Known Oil, I'm going to shade the rest of the details that we've just painted. So with all the areas of lead belcher and the casing to the bolt pistol. Also going to catch anything we painted with Retributor armour as well. And all the pouches, the belt, and all of the details. I'm just going to catch them all with a shade of Known Oil. Don't forget to be nice and careful when you're shading the Aquila here on his helmet and the one on his chest. Try not to get this over any of the areas of black we've already painted.
It's gonna be legend! Wait for it.
If you're enjoying the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. If you would like to support the channel and become a member, please press the join button down below.
Dairy! Legendary!
As you can see, after those shades have dried, it's really added definition all over the miniature. So now it's time to start highlighting these areas. First of all, with some Bugman's Glow, I'm going to come in and start highlighting the skin. For this, I'm applying this wherever the shade didn't settle. So you can see here on his cheek, the shade has settled into this recess. I'm coming in on either side, bringing it back up to its original colour with a thin layer of Bugman's Glow on all of the raised details, but leaving that White Flesh shade in all of the recesses. Same on the hands here, between all the fingers, where the shade has settled, coming in on either side, bringing the rest of the hand back up to colour with some Bugman's Glow. With that Bugman's Glow applied, you can see it's brought some colour back to these areas of skin. So now with a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone, I'm going to come in and apply this in the middle of all the areas that we just applied the Bugman's Glow. So leave a little bit of Bugman's Glow showing, but apply a bit of this mix on all the more raised areas and highest details where the light would catch. This will help build up that transition to our brightest highlights. On the areas like the hand, I'm applying this in the middle of all of the fingers, leaving a little bit of that Bugman's Glow showing, bring these areas up to a brighter colour. And with that mix applied, it's added another layer of brightness to those areas of skin. Now with some pure Cadian Flesh Tone, and once again coming in and applying this in the middle of the areas that we just applied that previous mix. So once again, leave a little bit of those previous colours showing through, and apply some of this in the middle of all the areas that we just applied that 50-50 mix. And on areas here like the hand, I'm focusing this towards the highest points, nearer to the knuckles, areas that would catch the light and are generally lighter. And with that Cadian Flesh Tone applied, there's just one final highlight left to apply to the skin. And that's with some Kislev flesh. I'm going to pick out the most raised details on the skin. So it's areas here like the tip of his nose, the bottom lip and chin, catching these with a thin line of Kislev flesh. Also any sharp pronounced lines on the tips of his ears and these cheekbones here, I'm just catching these with a thin edge highlight of Kislev flesh. And on the hands, I'm focusing this onto the knuckles of all the fingers, as well as the tips of any exposed fingers as well. And with that Kislev flesh applied, that's all of the skin highlighted. So the next step is to paint the eyes on the model. So for this, first of all, I'm coming in with some Abaddon Black. I'm going to sink this into the recesses of the eye sockets. Be nice and careful around all the areas of skin we've already painted and highlighted. Just sinking a little bit of Abaddon Black into those eye sockets. And then with some white scar, I'm going to come in and paint a really thin line in the middle of that Abaddon Black we just applied. Nice and careful, I'm just keeping this nice and thin, just applying a thin line of white scar in the middle of the Abaddon Black. And finally with some Abaddon black again, I'm going to paint a small vertical line through the middle of the white scar, which will act like a pupil. With those eyes painted, that's the face finished and really brings the model to life. So now with some white scar again, I'm going to come in and highlight the band going around the top of his hat, just catching the very edge with a thin line of white scar. Always been really careful around the skin we've already painted, just catching the very edge with a thin highlight of white scar. With that hat band highlighted, next I'm going to move on to is the areas of Mechanica Standard Grey. So for this I'm coming in with Mechanica Standard Grey again. And much like with the skin, wherever the shade settled in the recesses, I'm coming in on either side and bringing it back up to its original colour with a thin layer of Mechanica Standard Grey. So on the belt you can clearly see where the Nuln Oil has settled into those recesses, so I'm bringing the rest of the belt back up to a brighter colour with a thin layer of Mechanica Standard Grey, whilst doing the same on the inside of these wrist guards here. And with that Mechanica Standard Grey applied, you can see it's brought some colour back to these areas of the model. So next I'm coming in with a 50-50 mix of Mechanica Standard Grey and Dawnstone, and applying this in the middle of the areas that we just applied the Mechanica Standard Grey. So leaving some of the Mechanica Standard Grey showing through at the edges, coming in with a little bit of this mix, just applying it in the middle of all those areas that we just applied the pure Mechanica Standard Grey. Mix applied, it's brightened up those areas again. So now it's time to apply some pure Dawnstone, which will apply this once again into the middle of those areas that we just applied that 50-50 mix. This will really brighten these areas up and add some definition and add a nice transition all of our areas of grey. With that Dawnstone applied, there is just one final highlight to apply to the grey areas to really make them stand out. With some pure Administratum Grey. So I'm just going to apply as an edge highlight to the very sharpest edges of all these areas of grey. So on the belt, it's just around the very edge, catching this with a thin edge highlight of Administratum Grey, as well as picking out any of the visible holes on the belt. Wrist guards, it's just picking out any sharp angles or highest points with a thin edge highlight of Administratum Grey as well. And with that grey highlighted, you can see it's really added a pop of colour going around the middle of the model. So now with some Evil Sun Scarlet, I'm going to highlight the wire coming from his power sword. And for this I'm just applying a thin line going around the sharpest edge of the wire. And with that wire highlighted, the next thing I'm going to highlight are the leather pouches. So for this, I'm coming with Mornfang Brown first. And I'm applying this as sort of a chunky highlight around all the details on these pouches. So it doesn't need to be as thin as a standard edge highlight, but just make sure you catch all of the edges with a chunky highlight of Mornfang Brown. By combining this Mornfang Brown with the next step, we'll get a nice warm leather look on all of these pouches. So with the chunky highlight applied, the next step is to come in with a thin edge highlight within that chunky highlight. For that, I'm using XV88. I'm just going to apply this as a real thin edge highlight within that Mornfang Brown. So make sure you leave some of the Mornfang Brown showing. Highlight the very edges and sharpest points with a thin line of XV88. These two colours work really well with the Rhinox hide to give the appearance of slightly worn and used leather. Make sure you keep these lines nice and thin. Just pick out all of these details with a thin edge highlight of XV88. And with that XV88 applied, there's all of these pouches highlighted. Now there's just a few details left to highlight on the model. So I'm coming in with some Mechanica Standard Grey again now. I'm going to apply this as a chunky highlight onto the casing to his bolt pistol. Once again, this doesn't need to be as thin as an edge highlight, but just come through with a chunky edge highlight of Mechanica Standard Grey and the edges of all the details on the casing for his bolt pistol. And with that chunky highlight applied, the next step is to come in and apply a thinner edge highlight of Dawnstone within that Mechanica Standard Grey chunky highlight. So much like with the pouches, I'm just applying a real thin edge highlight of Dawnstone on the very edges of all the areas of the bolt casing, but leaving a little bit of Mechanica Standard Grey showing through to give us a really nice looking two-tone highlight. And with that bolt pistol highlighted, all that's left to do now is to highlight any of the metallic details on the model. So I'm coming in with some Stormhost Silver. I'm going to apply this to all of the areas that we painted with Lead Belcher. That's an edge highlight. So for the sword here, I'm catching the sharpest edges with an edge highlight of Stormhost Silver. Again, catch all the edges on the metallic parts of his bolt pistol as well, catching these with a thin edge highlight of Stormhost Silver, as well as any other details we paint with Lead Belcher as well. So the engine here, I'm catching this with a highlight of Stormhost Silver, and any of these studs here on these metallic panels, as well as any sharp angles, I'm catching these with some Stormhost Silver as well. With that Stormhost Silver applied, that's all the areas of Lead Belcher highlighted. So now it's just the areas of gold left to highlight. So for this, I'm using Liberator Gold. I'm just going to pick out any of the areas of Retributor armour with a thin edge highlight of Liberator Gold. So on the sword, it's areas like that little node on the blade, as well as an edge highlight on the hilt. On these details here, I'm catching any raised edges with a thin edge highlight of Liberator Gold. Things like the wings here, just catching the raised parts to make them stand out. So you're not forgetting to do the same to the smaller Quilla on his hat. And all these edges to these metallic plates as well. I'm just catching these with a real thin highlight of Liberator Gold as well.
I hear they need a new lieutenant. Want the job?
And with that Liberator Gold applied, that is how to paint an Imperial Guard Commissar in the style of Carl Jenkins from Starship Troopers. All that's left to do now is to paint the base in a style you like, as well as add any effects to the power sword that you would like to add. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please let me know in the comments down below what other models from 40k would you like to see me paint in the style of another franchise. But thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and happy painting!